and welcome to the As Yet Unnamed podcast, Untitled podcast. We'll figure this out. I don't know why I'm talking to the camera because this is not going to be in anything because we'll cut it out and probably re-record it. But I would like to welcome Katie Surridge, who is someone who I have been aware of your work for probably about a year and a half, almost 2 years now, since I think I first came across you on Instagram, seeing your metalwork because we share circles. You currently work at Chelsea College of Arts, which is where I did my bachelor's, and I currently work at Goldsmiths, which is where we have both recently completed MFAs, but on different courses. You then also came to my attention, but separately through EWaste amnesty boxes, which we'll get onto. Mm-hmm. And they were placed around Goldsmiths, especially by the front entrance. And so after, I don't know, a couple months after they'd been up, I realized that these two names that I had both been like, oh, these are great ideas and I'd like this work, actually were the same person. And then finally at your degree show, I sought you out and luckily you were by your work. And yes, we've got to become acquainted.
Finally. Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you for being here. And you are our first guest on this podcast and hopefully not the last. First of all, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. So it's really kind of you to have me today. It's nice to come and have a chat, a more informal chat about the way things are going, what I've been thinking about. So hi, my name's Katie. I'm mainly a sculptor. I suppose I base myself out in Essex now, which is where my workshop is. And I have just finished my MFA at Goldsmiths. I've been working within like kind of metalwork fields for some time now. I suppose it all started for me probably about 10 or 12 years ago when I broke my leg at Boomtown. Okay. And then thought I need to be doing something more than just messing around with paper mache. And that kind of led me down the route of Googling. I found the National School of Blacksmithing, which is where I kind of did 3 years training. And that really opened my eyes to a lot of my interest in metalwork and thinking about where materials come from, as well as like ancient crafts and practices. So that breaking that leg was a really transformative moment for me.
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned you did 3 years studying blacksmithing. Where was that again?
That's the National School of Blacksmithing in Hereford, and it's an incredible place. It's a centre for rural craft, so they do farriery and blacksmithing, and it was an outside of the kind of, I suppose, BA, MA world which we find ourselves in. It was very much like a BTEC training, skills, craft, and you kind of got ran through welding, fabrication, as well as hot metal forging.
What sort of stuff did you find yourself making there? Were you being artistic and sculptural then?
You know what? For the first year, I really struggled with it. It was we weren't really given that freedom. So I suppose to learn anything, you have to first of all learn how to work with your material. So, you know, we were given projects like making hammers, making tongs, essentially making all our own equipment so that we can carry on when we left. And it wasn't till, and I only really intended to spend a year there. And then I was like kind of got to this point with my making and learning where I was kind of frustrated that I hadn't got enough skills. So instead of quitting, like I think is very easy to do, and I'm quite proud of myself for that, I kind of challenged myself to stay on for another 2 years. And it wasn't really till the third year that, you know, you start kind of your hand-eye coordination becomes good enough that you can start making creative decisions in how you make things. So
I just want to keep with that theme of your metalworking education, because I saw on your website, actually, or maybe it was mentioned in your dissertation where you talked about making a knife in Japan. And so studying metalworking in Japan for a bit. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so that was a a project I actually wrote to something called the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, and they support learning and traveling abroad. So the project I wrote was called Rediscovering Lost Techniques for Sculptural Use. And the idea in this project is that you, with the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, is you go abroad, you study some skills, and you bring them back to kind of teach or learn or implement back here. So my project was two-part. One of them was in Ireland, and the other, as you mentioned, was Japan. So yeah, I was in Japan for 2 months. It was incredible. It was really focused on smelting iron. So in Japan they have a kind of magnetic sand. It's incredible. You can go on the beach with a magnet.
Really?
Yeah.
And just pick it up and then put it in a bucket and smelt it out.
Yeah. So that's where that.
Would you be able to show us where you might have?
Yeah, it is. Let me have a little. I think if you go to research projects, there we go, and it's called Rediscovering Lost Techniques for Sculptural Use.
Wonderful. You've got some foundries here,
I suppose they're kind of like smelting furnaces, I suppose.
Yeah.
Would you like me to just?
Yes, please talk about what's going on.
So I suppose I work on that kind of intersect between ancient and modern. And so these are the shape of the furnaces which we use to smelt iron in Europe, I'd say. In Japan, we were working with it on a much larger scale and they became rectangular. The material they've made from is really interesting. It's a cob mix. So it's...
Yeah. I've seen, I'm sure you're aware of... Primitive Technology, the channel on YouTube.
Yeah, and so good.
He's made many of those sorts of things, and also How to Make Everything has made loads of cob-based furnaces. So describe what cob is and how it's used in this format.
Yeah, so cob is we've got some hay or straw in there. We've got some sand. We've got some clay. We've got some water, and we've also got some horse dung. And that kind of mix of clay, water, sand, plus the fibres, which are provided by the horse dung and the straw, that kind of, in this instance, it knots it together, but it also allows the structure to breathe a bit as well. So, and it's an ancient material, I suppose, which have been used for building for a very long time. And in this, it also insulates. So that's why it's great for furnaces.
And so that can get like a hot enough fire to be able to do iron. Can it do like steel or?
Yeah, we could. So how it works in the furnaces is you're feeding the iron ore and charcoal plus an air source. So that air source is what's getting it up to temperature and causing the reaction between the iron ore and the charcoal. Now, probably a much more experienced smelter is going to listen to this and laugh, but iron oxide is like FeO and you're adding carbon. So you're basically from the charcoal. So you're trying to drive off that extra oxygen, which always bonds to the iron. So essentially you're formed with a lump of solid iron. So it's not actually liquid when you smelt. Which is quite surprising.
I guess so, because I'm used to seeing like pouring big like lumps of metal out as liquid, but it stays solid the whole way.
Yeah, it forms like a spongy mass at the bottom, and you do see some liquid running out at the bottom, but that's the slags, that's the impurities.
The waste material.
Yeah, exactly. So anything like.
So the reason why I guess we're like looking into and digging into your history with metalworking is the theme of this podcast being about art and technology. And metallurgy is one of the great leap forwards in terms of human capability and technology. So, and you've already mentioned about how you like to bring in those ancient techniques into your artwork. So I guess, because we've jumped ahead a little bit here, let's rein it back. And let me start by asking you a very open, very possibly difficult question. What is technology?
Yeah, so when you said you were going to ask me this question, I kind of felt like I was like, God, like, am I the right person for this podcast? But then, we can start to unpick these questions and start to kind of lead it into my own practice. Because, at one stage, I have a big phobia of like the idea of computing and using modern technology. So I think I'd answer what is technology in an idea of more, it's a development of skills, and it's a continuum. So it's been happening ever since man first picked up a stone and sharpened it to form an axe. And I really focus in on those like ancient technologies.
Mm-hmm.
There was thinking about great inventions are like hammers, or even pieces of string, things which tie things together, things which chop, things which cut. I just love to be in the kind of brain of the person who first smelted iron, or the first person who started making tools. So for me, technology is things we use every day.
Mm-hmm.
It's things which help you be a better you, I suppose. For me, it's got to be an ancient thing. I relate it to an ancient thing.
So would you say it's, to expand on what you're saying there, the creation of tools, like like discovery of something that allows the creation of more things?
Yeah, that's definitely. And I think a lot of what I think about is making tools to help me make art. So technology to make you be able to create something is essentially that's what it all does, isn't it? Yeah. You have computers which help you create something more beautiful or more practical or more in tune with what you're thinking. So it's definitely, it's a means to an end, or a means to create.
Do you find that within your artwork itself, that the questions that you ask and expose are of technology, especially the technologies that you're using to make them up, so the metallurgy or clay work, for example? Or do you find that you use those technologies that you're interested in, those developments of skills that you've garnered, in order to more efficiently ask different questions that might be more sociological or more non-self-reflexive?
So if I'm right in just thinking, so you're asking, do I kind of reinvent old technologies for my own use, or am I trying to invent a new technology? Is that kind of the crux of it?
I think that's, I don't know if that's what I was getting at, but I kind of like that as a better question. Do you find that your artwork is trying to question the means with which you're making it?
I suppose in a sense it is. I think what my interest is how detached we are from it.
Okay.
So being able to bring, I can't claim to be an expert at any of this, but what I am interested in is how perhaps the technology which we're much more comfortable with is something which, like computers, phones, we're comfortable in handling that every day. But what I've been thinking about recently is the idea of fire, and how without heat, without objects which create, without fire, you probably wouldn't have a phone, because there's smelting, there's heat, there's process, there's power. But actually, when we look at a lot of these ancient technologies, that development and use of fire is something we're so distant from now. In ancient times, a kind of a day well spent might be striking two flints together, and if perhaps you lit a bit of tinder, that would be a day well spent. You had fire, you had warmth, you had the ability to cook, create, and that idea that maybe life essentially evolved out the equator where it was warm. So that dependence on heat, fire, fire allowed us to live in different places where it was colder, where places were harder. So that feels like something we're really detached from. And so I've tried to do some writing recently, and starting to think about like how I can centralize my thoughts on like fire as the greatest technology.
Okay, I like that as a premise, because as you say, like heat is so necessary. We're whilst the world is warming, it's still, we do get our cold snaps.
But we need heat to keep cool in a weird way. Like
exactly.
we need to burn power. We need power. Yeah, it's like.
And we've Yeah, and we're kind of culpable for our own like desire for all of that by burning all of the fossil fuels and finding easier ways to make fire. But I agree with you in that fire being that like primordial technology, something that as soon as it became useful would have been revolutionary in every sense. Like cooking in terms of heat, in terms of like
making more digestible food.
Exactly.
Even, like you think we're pretty much the only species who, like most species have a fear of fire. Like I can't think of another species, there isn't one who's kind of started to use it and who doesn't show fear of it. And I want, there's an interesting book. I'm not going to say I've read a lot of it, but it's J.G. Fraser's. It's called The Myths and Origins of Fire. Myths of the Origins of Fire. And basically, most cultures have a kind of creation story which involves fire, or has animals which kind of gave fire to man as a gift. But that's quite interesting. A, that the fire is so central to so many creation stories, but B, that the animals are often written into these stories as the one who bring the fire, but there's that fear of it.
So it's sort of, I guess, with all these origin stories, I guess it's no surprise that the Prometheus story also follows that same thing of humanity sort of becomes independent in the same way that like animals probably give way to man after that development and gift of fire. And so it must be a kind of ancient memory, I guess you could say, as like a cultural artifact that fire is the breaking point for where we start to be kind of a human culture as opposed to a human animal, if you want to make, if it's not terrible to make a distinction like that.
I think it's a fair point. And I think just having all these stories show how important it is. So fire and technology, that's how I'd kind of answer it, I suppose.
So with fire and with technology, you talked about before the idea of slow making and being more involved in the overall productive efforts of something that you're making. So you mention the artist Sigrid Holmwood, who makes her own pigments from stuff she's grown in her garden. And you yourself have made your own iron ore or smelted your own iron ore. So talk us through we've already discussed how like fire is a driving force in that, but what is it that connection with the earliest stages, like the pre-art stages of the process of making an artwork actually interests you and inspires you?
Well, I sort of like, just maybe slightly off topic, but I saw this funny Instagram post the other day, and it said something, like today, just to step outside your front door, you have to spend $100, like, or it was an American ad, but it's like that idea of like life is getting expensive. Like things feel like expensive and hard to reach. So that aside, I do think there's this kind of reverse, especially among people like our age, who are like, we want to know how things are done because it's interesting, and it becomes like, I can't say it's a money-saving technique, because smelting your own iron is definitely not an efficient way to spend your money. But there's definitely something, maybe we've hit a wall. Maybe we've got to a point where we're starting. Well, I certainly am starting to question, like, or feel a guilt about having all this stuff, having too much material goods. So I suppose in addressing where things come from, or understanding in a really like sick way, like you feel more prepared, you feel more like understanding of where you come from. Or
do you think there's a bit of sort of morbid existential dread that society is going to disappear, and so like I need to learn how to farm in my back garden?
I really do. Like, and it's a horrible thing to think, but
eco prepper.
Am I an eco prepper? I did actually think about that, because obviously I do a lot of growing of food and things like that. Understanding where things come from just seems, I think it might stem from when I was doing my BA, there was a group of us and we were squatting, and it kind of built this like DIY attitude among us. Like, if your taps aren't working, like you live in this building, there's no pipes, like, well, what are you going to do? Because you live there. So go and steal loads of hose pipe from B&Q, make yourself a water system, and then the house is livable. And that kind of, 5 years of always living in those kind of situations, I like to look back of it. It's funny, I only have fond memories, and it sounds like it could be a bit crazy and wild. You had one bag, you could go where you want, you were out your house by the morning, sometimes if the police turned up. But it was just that ability to understand how to fix things, how to make things work.
Is that also a self-reliance?
Yeah,
that
self-reliance.
You're proud of? Like you say, you look back and had fond memories, and I guess is that even when times were difficult, looking back on it now, that whatever that difficulty was, you always were there yourself to get yourself through it.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're very distanced from how things are done, or there's always somebody on the phone. You can let's phone somebody to fix that. Let's phone somebody to make that. So it feels cool. It feels great to understand how things work and how things fix. And I think I like to be inquisitive, really.
So when you didn't click and purchased from Amazon your smelted iron and you did it yourself, can you talk us through, start with why that was a thing for you to do, and then tell us how you did it, what the process is?
Well, I just finished up 3 years at Hereford, and I suppose I was like on the cusp of, I could now make things in iron. I was quite fluid in my movements, hand-eye coordination, like I mentioned earlier. But then I started thinking, well, where is this stuff coming from? Like, I went to the V&A, and you can see they've got a beautiful collection of like early ironwork, and it's still so beautiful, but you actually have to think those people were smelting bars of iron. They had to make it before they could even forge the objects. And at first I just thought it was a bit of a harebrained idea, and I didn't think that many people would do it. But like most of the things I'm interested in are these like niche communities and groups which form around different specialities, and that's another really important thing in my work, is these kind of the social side of it, the interaction with people. So I found this group in Ireland, and they were setting up a festival called the Furnace Festival, and it was all these people from all over the world who had an interest in smelting iron. And it turns out that there's quite a select group who come together all over the world to do this. And it was really them who taught me how to do it. So we started off the festival by, it was in Galway in Western Ireland, Northeast South, West Ireland. And so we started off in the bogs, and bogs are full of magic and mystery. And I think these ancient technologies, there's a sense of magic and mystery, and the bog symbolizes that. The bog is a dark, dingy, scary place, but at the same time, it was providing iron ore for early man. So that's where we started.
So
really.
when you say the iron comes from the bog, what do you mean? Are you digging up mud? Are you like digging for rocks?
You're like digging a really crumbly, like how do I describe it? It's a dark red crumbly material. So it's not rocks. It's produced by kind of bacterial action over thousands of years in environments with very low oxygen. Okay. So you end up with this kind of crumbly, dusty red stuff. So you take off the topsoil, you're knee deep in water, you're kind of digging around, and you find these nuggets, so to speak. And they then get taken away from the bog, and we did the smelting in a field nearby. So they get chucked into a furnace, chopped up with charcoal, fire, air.
Would this be one of those cob furnaces?
Exactly, one of those cob furnaces. And there the magic happens, and you can't see what's happening inside your furnace. So essentially you could run it for 4 hours and you could make nothing. And that's like, I suppose that's like for you, like writing, I don't know, writing programs. Like you can invest so much into it, but actually
And then
just
you press
one.
run, and then it's just
Nothing.
like, no.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting, like the way that you talk about the bog, and you've mentioned before your interest in Ireland and your desire to live there. You were talking about horses earlier,
Yeah.
but we'll move on from them at the moment. But yeah, tell us more about like how that landscape, beyond its iron-rich content, is a feature in how you like, or if it's a feature in what kind of art you made or made when you were there.
I suppose the landscape of Ireland, it still seems to me to have that kind of connection with the rural, which we don't seem. Which I'm a London girl, you know. I'm very much a city person, and I was very aware of how detached I am from that kind of rural lifestyle when I spent 2 months in Ireland, and what I really felt a connection to was this idea of mythology and storytelling and sharing. And I think my practice is a lot about putting myself in communities or new situations and understanding and trying to translate those stories into contemporary version, perhaps.
Do you have an example that we can talk about that you think would look at that kind of mythology?
Yeah, like I think maybe we could look at the Belfaleum. So this thinking about that kind of not ancient, but jobs which people don't do so much anymore. I mean, I've got this medal which features in this this sculpture, and it was my great grandfathers who used to collect rubbish from the streets of London with horse and cart. So again, that mythical notion of the horse as so useful, an early technology. So it was something I owned, and he was apparently a rag and bone man, and he would collect rubbish from the streets of London and take it to Wandsworth, and it would get sailed down, dumped out in mucking marshes, and used to reclaim land.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically they were quite smart. They were like using the rubbish and reclaiming land, so they were kind of double earning on that.
I mean, the rents on those now must be amazing.
Yeah, like out on the marshes, and so this story really fascinated me. And my grandmother was quite old when she died, and she would tell of this. Like, I can't remember if it was her grandparent. It must have been her grandfather, who had a little green canary who sat on his shoulders while he was driving these barges down to mucking marshes, and it all just sounded so beautifully like. I don't know how much of it's true, how much is not. But anyway, fast forward to today, this guy starts driving down my road in Peckham with a horse and cart, collecting scrap metal. And I was just like, whoa, I haven't seen this in London, this. So I kind of followed him, actually. And it turns out just at the end of my road, it's so sad it's shut down now on St James's Road, there's a stables there.
Really?
Yeah, it's been obviously it shut down a few years ago now, but you can still see the stables. So I started lurking around there, basically just stroking the horses, seeing if I could make friends with him. And he's called Liam, and he'd give me. We got to a stage where he'd give me cigarettes when I came and helped look at the horse, whatever. And then I said, "Oh, Liam, do you reckon you'd take me out one day on the horse?" And he, it was a bit of like toing and froing. But eventually, he started taking me out on the horse and cart, and he was a character. He had a huge crowbar under his seat, and he drove around. I'd usually meet him outside Burgess Park. He'd pull the horse onto the pavement and wait for me, and we'd ride around South London looking for iron. Basically.
What was his backstory? How did he get into that line of work, into that kind of lifestyle, which is so antithetical to like modernity? That's so rebellious.
I don't really know his backstory. He was a bit of a wild character.
Was he an old man at the time?
He must have been about 40.
So not very
50, not that old.
Yeah.
we didn't really chat about that too much, but I mean, his horse was called Beauty. He seemed to really like look after her, but I'm not sure how he got into the scrap metal, but I was very interested in cast iron. So you can't really melt yourself steel, so we had to look for cast iron because that's meltable.
Yeah.
So basically we'd go out, and funnily enough, the mega hall of cast iron, which this work is actually made from, was the Victorian water pipes outside the South London Gallery.
Wow. Okay.
So I've got a beautiful picture. I think it's on there. And it's Beauty. He just pulled her up onto the pavement. That's the cast iron we used.
See, yeah.
And then perhaps the next shot that's it being poured. Try one. That's Beauty there.
And is that Liam?
That's Liam. He didn't like having his photo taken, so I feel a bit guilty about having that up. That's us out and about. That's outside the South London Gallery.
Yeah, wow.
So he just pulled Beauty up onto the pavement, and I love that kind of disregard for like what's right and what should be right. I mean, look, it's a double red. I
wonder what the traffic laws are for a horse.
Horse and car. I know. And then he dropped me home. And
that's
then the bell was made.
Where does the stand come from? Because this is, again, like you talk about the rag and bone man as being like quite an antiquated profession. And this sort of Victorian-esque type, what do you call like
painted
work? Yeah,
painted
the livery
work.
on the stand. It has that same evocation to me.
I mean, it's I suppose I kind of draw links to that of like kind of old style Romany or Gypsy travellers in bow top caravans, and that kind of link to and his cart was painted in a similar manner, so it was kind of like thinking about that culture of people who travel, who are on the road, and that idea of being mobile, I suppose, for me is something which I return to, like thinking about, at the moment I'm thinking about how to make a mobile bronze furnace. There's that, in one sense, it's quite, I don't know, there's something, it's again, maybe back to that idea of preparing for the apocalypse, which I don't want to sound like a complete nutter, but making people aware of, like, as there's more and more wars, more and more people are displaced, like how do we address that in a mobile workshop perhaps? It's completely unfeasible, because if you were displaced or had a huge war, I mean, probably the last thing you'd think about is pulling your workshop. But I do think it raises some interesting questions about actually how like artists make things, and how we are very tied to our workshop. I mean, obviously my workshop's out in Essex, but I live and work in London, so I'm almost making a pilgrimage every time I go out there, and I spend 3 or 4 days out there in quite a weird kind of isolated industrial estate. And I think, sorry, this answer's gone a bit long-winded and rambly, but like that isolation of making and how to make it mobile, how to bring making to people is something
I think it was quite beautiful the way you just described going to your studio, your workshop as a pilgrimage. I think there has to be something, if not religious, at least spiritual, about the artistic process, about the idea of making and creating. And when you talk about the issues that the world itself is facing with displaced people, there's going to need to be tool makers and people creatively using what's around them to rebuild, to build wherever they end up. Which I guess, to tie in with the rag and bone man, I'd like to talk about your project Modern Mining.
Okay.
For those very reasons of that's looking at both the waste that we accrue, but also looking at the computer and computerized objects as being materials and physical materials, as opposed to the abstract logical thinking machines that we often get carried away with, when they do have a significant physical impact on the world. So could you begin by explaining, what brought you into this line of investigation and research?
So I suppose that I see the Iron Age and smelting my own iron as really the roots of that. And I started to think, well, look, in the Iron Age, people were mining for iron ore. What's the modern equivalent? Where are our resources today? So there was an interesting fact that I think a ton of e-waste, or perhaps we should call it e-resource, is what I'm trying to think of it as currently. It contains more gold than any mined ton of rock.
Right. So it's a richer.
It's a richer source of gold. And that kind of, it may or may not be true, but that kind of instantly grabbed my attention. There's as humans, we're just attracted to gold, and the gold fever hit me, and I started thinking, oh my gosh, there's what is going on where we're chucking away tons and tons of gold essentially, but also what else is in there? So modern mining was kind of constructed as a way to think about a way for me to gather and source my own materials, but also kind of draw people's attention to this huge amount of waste. Now, it becomes a bit of a difficult project, because I don't claim to be trying to solve everything with it, and I don't want to, I'm not like a huge eco maniac right now, but it is something which I wanted to address, without, it's just, I don't know why I find it sometimes like a sticky situation, doing work about ecological problems, or I think
someone once said it to me that the job of an artist isn't necessarily to be the perfect example of what you're looking at, but it's to look at those things. And so you can be less efficient because, your workshops, which I'll ask you to explain in a minute, they're going to teach people and bring people who otherwise wouldn't have thought about these things into that line of thinking. But obviously themselves are not going to be as efficient as a recycling center is at dealing with these things. But I think there is a leeway, not just leeway, I think more than that, but where as an artist you are allowed to not be an industrialized aspect of culture. You can use those inefficiencies to very pointedly ask people or yourself even just to investigate and see something for what it is, which I guess links back to your slow making and also idea.
Perhaps that's another thing which just throwing more stuff into the mix is the idea of the amateur as well, which is something
of course.
I'm kind of flitting around with the modern mining. I'm not a professional I'm not a professional industrially company who's taking things apart, but what am I? Am I this? Am I that? And I think the idea of the amateur is something I'm trying to cherish as well. Being in that uncomfortable zone where you don't know if you're very good at something, but you're going to do it anyway. So modern mining is all about helping people realize that there's usable materials inside our old electronics, and slowly building a system to teach people and show people that. So it started off very simply by installing amnesty boxes, so people could donate for old electronics, and then I built this modern mining rig after visiting Mumbai actually. So I got some funding from a prize, the Dare Art Prize, so I got to travel to Mumbai and go and see all the mountains and mountains. Oh my goodness, it was of e-waste, which ends up kind of not in our country, I suppose. It just gets dumped in other countries.
Is that waste that's been shipped in from all over the world? Is it?
From what I understand, is that we're not allowed to sell or have sell broken e-waste to other countries.
Right.
However, from what I gathered from speaking to people there, it kind of goes to Dubai. All our broken stuff goes to Dubai, where it kind of gets relabeled and ends up in India. Whereas it should all be processed and dealt with in our own country. There's some kind of dodgy relabeling which goes on, and it turns up there. And I was in this area near the airport in Mumbai, and I walked around it for about 2 weeks, and I couldn't really ever find the end of it. You know, it was just like, you know, area, like, you know, little unit after unit of different people breaking things up manually by hand. So essentially that's what my modern mining installation is. It's a hand. You break things up by hand, and that's important to me too, because the idea of being detached from tooling, or even, you know, lots of people don't really feel comfortable holding a hammer, for example. Like one woman came up to me when I was running the workshop with the hammer, and she held the hammer out in front of her, and she was like, "Is this dangerous?" And I was just like, the hammer isn't dangerous. Don't worry. You might be dangerous. So that like connection of people with tools, understanding what materials are inside, empowering people with knowledge. It was quite a lovely project, actually. So we were breaking things up, and I was particularly interested in copper, which I think again has lots of interesting, you know, it's an interesting healing metal. You know, some people wear it for arthritis. It's quite a beautiful color. You know, there's lots of appealing qualities to copper. Also, you can melt it yourself. So that led on to also building my own foundry, which I've just finished.
Okay. Well, then I'll ask you about your foundry in a moment. I was going to ask what happens to the materials once people have processed them. What's the follow-on of the project?
So we were basically splitting it down quite simply. So there's kind of aluminium, copper, iron, plastics, glass. And where I'm trying to go with this project now is obviously in the printed circuit boards, there's a whole heap of metals. And that's where I'm really interested in kind of really starting to focus this interest now. So obviously there's this it's not a new technology. It's been around for thousands of years, bacteria leaching metal out of the earth. Which
we were talking about with the bugs.
Yeah, with the bugs. So so now there's a scientist in Coventry who I'm hoping to work with who's doing bioleaching. So that's essentially you're grinding up your printed circuit boards and your chips into a powder, and you're feeding them to bugs. To bacteria,
Wow. So, can you talk us a bit more about that process? Because you've been to visit the bioleaching facility, right?
So he's got a lab in Coventry, and they're now doing it industrially in Cambridge. So this is actually a technology which is happening, it's working, and I hope it happens more. So they get the printed circuit boards, they grind them up into a very fine blacky brown powder, and that gets fed to bacteria, and they're suspended in a liquid. And the bacteria, to really simplify it, they like eating iron. So they digest ions of iron. And when they eat the iron, the waste product is an acid. So it becomes a suspended acid liquid, which then can dissolve different metals into the liquid, which are then electroplated out of that liquid.
Okay.
So copper dissolves quite easily into like a blue liquid, like copper sulfate, you know. So that can then the anode and the cathode, and they can get the copper out. So it's pretty.
What other metals do you remember are in the PCBs?
There's help. So I don't really know exactly. I can't tell you, but there's lots. Big old mixes. I mean, things you don't even know, all the blidiums and lithiums and blah, blah, blah.
And do you have a potential use that you'd like to put them to once you've leached them out, or of the metals that you've already recovered? Are these going to be sculptural works? How do you see this material that you've recovered going to be used?
So electroplating is where you just put a thin layer on like a metallic surface, but electroforming is when you build up a much thicker layer. And you can electroform on a lot of things. You can electroform a leaf. You can electroform wax. So my idea and interest as a sculptor is how to make, probably wax is a great sculpting material, which has been, associated with lost wax for thousands of years. How can I sculpt in wax and then electroform onto it, because wax is non-conductive?
Yeah.
So by using something like a graphite paint, I can paint that onto the wax shape.
Yeah.
And then I can electroform onto the wax.
Wow. Okay.
So building up a really thick layer on top of a wax is something I've started researching. And there's companies who do it. I think there's like BJS, which is a company, an artist I really like. Well, he's more of a silversmith called David Clark. If you put David Clark silversmith, some of his, there we go, he does a lot of silversmithing, but also electroforming. So incredible work. And he uses that company. And it basically allows, what I'm hoping to do, they don't use, they're using proper solutions. They don't use bacteria. Maybe, there we go. Look at those. So those beautiful bowls are
so they're electroformed.
So inside that was once wax, and he's basically covered it in a thick layer, burnt out the wax, and then you just get solid silver.
Yeah. Are these bulbous forms the wax itself, or is this silver that's deposited on
it's
top
the wax itself?
Okay.
So the wax, you would obviously, the shape of that you sculpt, the edges would come slightly fuzzier, you know, as the thickness builds up. Yeah. But essentially, you are sculpting you have the exact form then covered in. And so what I want to do is use the liquid from the bacteria to electroform directly from.
Wow, yeah.
So this is one of the things which is keeping me up at night at the moment, writing an Arts Council application. But while I'm doing, too much job work and not thinking about my art, I'm kind of sidelining that till March to write it. So,
wow, fantastic. So I guess I've got another really open question.
Yeah,
and I think because we've just talked about like PCBs and the way that you use PCBs, obviously very different to the way that I use computers.
Yeah.
So, to you, what is the computer? And an addendum question, what is the computer as a material?
What is the computer? Wow. I mean, like, gosh, I imagine like some of your future guests will have really exciting answers. But for me, the computer is the enemy. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. I'm going to say it. The computer for me is like the unknown, and I really struggle with like. Maybe I'm a more of a primitive person, but I don't understand how it works. I feel very detached and isolated from it. So if anything, for me, the computer is a source of materials. Yeah. And that's how I like to think of them. And that's how I'm going to kind of use them moving forward. There's so much stuff inside it. Perhaps with my electroplating, my electroforming, I can start mining them rather than them mining my soul.
That's a fantastic line. Because, I think to a lot of us, the computer is at least evil in some regard because of all of that, mining. I thought when I first saw the modern mining, it did actually make me think of it as, I don't know if this was intentional, but it felt like a very intentional joke at crypto, because at the time that you were doing it was like during the massive crypto hype, and I was like, and when I first saw it, I was like, oh, this is like lambasting that, like the ego-led stupidity that crypto was by showing what materiality actually means.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it, but I love it. Yeah, definitely. Invest in the physical, rather than the kind of crypto invisibility. If perhaps if more people set about trying to realize, sometimes when I'm on the bus on the way home, I look out the window and I see how wasteful we are, I sometimes play this game in my head. I wonder if I picked up everything from A to B, what could I do with it? How much is its value? And would this happen in countries which are not so, economically good as we have, so as rich as we are, I suppose. And, you see so much thrown away. And I think, how can that be used, melted, recreated into things? So, if we dealt with problems a bit more than, e-waste, then we'd definitely be in a better position, I suppose.
Do you think that sort of sustainable outlook, is that something that is going to change based on how we view our identities tied up with our consumptive appetites? Or is it something that is going to require a more top-down legislative approach that changes, the way that corporations and businesses, larger businesses and entities like power-generating entities, where do you see that rift occurring, or perhaps even in both?
I mean, to give the computer some credit quickly, I am interested in the idea that perhaps, a lot of physical making, a lot of art making, there is a lot of waste that, and sometimes I'm getting this kind of this guilt of creating too much.
Yeah.
So that's, I think I've gone off tangent a little bit, but that idea of trying to make things well is really important. But the computer, if you're doing everything online or digitally, there seems to be almost less physical waste because everything's, controlled in digital images, less. But then I suppose digital waste, then you end up with a computer. So I don't know what the answer is to the sustainability question, but I do know that I do feel this kind of this pressing concern of can we just keep creating things? Where's it all going? What are we going to do with it? And as artists, are we just a step in that are we trying to solve it, or are we just the skit from A Degree Show? I mean, it's a tragedy, isn't it?
Yeah, you see perfectly usable wood just there, and but what, I don't have a van, so I cannot take this.
But if I had a van, so it seems like an impossible cycle, and I don't know what the answer is. But.
Is that you mentioned about overproduction as an artist, and that guilt of creating stuff, and then I guess where do you think that guilt comes from? Do you think it's because is that tied to an imposter syndrome where you're not 100% secure in oh, this thing needs to exist, and therefore now you're oh, am I bad for having made it exist? And then I guess a second part to that question is, do you think that's the industrialization of the art world in terms of the artist as being a studio rather than smaller, more isolated?
I mean, we are pressurized almost as artists to keep our Instagram page up to date, otherwise I think I wrote about it in my dissertation, the idea of if you're not updating every single day, you're seen as non-productive. Or so that idea to generate content, generate things is really pressing in our society. So but how does that translate into a practice where you really want to slow down and you really want to make things well? And I suppose I've come to address that with trying to use that platform as a way to share processes. And a lot of artists, I don't think, share process as much. It's just this is the finished product, bosh, and there's loads of secrets around how how that happens or where that came from. So I think I'm trying to like be like, oh well, I built this, it's been a bit shit, like it didn't work the first time, I've readapted it. And I think so that almost becomes like performative in a way, as like as a
I guess I have a question there, which then, because in its way of engulfing everything, like capital and technology, especially like, you know, Google, etc., like is that creation of showing off the process itself, as you say, it's like performative in a way. Does that start to supersede the making and become the thing that you're producing are the documentation of process rather than the object that you're setting out to
create? Yeah, I'd say they're equally as important, you know, the and that's where the magic gets weaved into it. So with the modern mining, the process of and all the conversations, there was a visitor's book, you know, and there was beautiful moments in that work. Like I was running it at B-Side Arts Festival, and I had 3 people in a day come up to me and say, this is 2 of his dads, one was his mum's, this is their old mobile phone. I've had it in a drawer for 5 years, I don't know what to do with it, I want to smash it up and give you the copper, which I then have I've just recently started melting this copper and casting it into these kind of modern relics. So
can we have a look at those?
I think you'll have to go to my Instagram page for that. So there's a link at the bottom of the, there we go. So creating, hopefully it all works. So creating these modern relics out of all this copper. So there we go. There's
this one.
No, that one there. Yeah. So that is it's me as a Bronze Age mirror. And I think if you flick through that, there we go. So that's basically the original Bronze Age mirror, 3200 BC. It features like Goddess Hathor as the handle. And I've had myself 3D scanned.
And then with the phone above it.
Yeah, instead of a sun disk. So the original, the circular disc on the head would have been highly polished. And used for ceremony and ritual. And then I started thinking, well, what do we use today? We basically spend our whole time looking into our phone. So that is cast from all the copper which it was extracted with hundreds of hours of public workshops.
Wow.
And I kept all the everybody signed the visitor's book. So once I need to finish it, it's very raw in that state. I need to cut off the runners, and the bits just up there, the pouring system. So that's how the metal gets into the mold. So they need all cutting off. But yeah, that kind of memories and metal, you know, I know that those 3 people's dead parents' phones are in that, and that's like that. Then gives a more a beautiful side to waste, doesn't it? It makes us like value it. It has a story. It has a life.
I appreciate that idea of ritualistic objects and like carrying within the material the histories that like were known to go in. And I guess I have a question. So I think it's very striking how you've like placed yourself in the artwork here. And what's the kind of process that you're going through that brings about that decision of that? Why did you put yourself in the middle?
As this goddess, I mean, it's quite weird, isn't it, when you put it like that? Like, actually, I had like one of my last tutorials, were like with one of my tutors was like, "This is a really weird object, Katie. Like, are you comparing yourself to a goddess?" Like, I mean.
But I think there's ways that I can look at it where it's like you've made this like workshop happen and you've brought these people together. Literally, you've melted all of these people's mini bits of story into this one object, and so it's imbibed within you. But like, it's an interesting like way to literally cast yourself. I mean, it's
almost like it. I mean, are there like kind of like, without sounding too awful, like godlike qualities? Like you control. There's a lot of control in that, isn't there? There's a lot of like, me setting up the workshops, running the workshops, building the equipment. So there's that. I think control is something I strive for in all of this, in a world where things seem so impossible to like hold on to, or impossible to, have any say or any agency, just like to be able to control sourcing my materials, casting my materials, and featuring in it. There's like,
well, it's a wonderful like cycle to itself.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask about how you feel about the workshop as kind of like an art practice, because it's something that I'm not particularly familiar with in terms of doing. But like, how did you come about? Like, is that something that's kind of always been there and natural to the way you've worked, like bringing in communities and building these activities that communally manufacture a greater spirit around it, and such that is embodied in the mirror?
Yeah, I mean, it's again like I suppose going back to ancient practices and how many people would have to be required to keep furnaces running, to keep workshops running. And so it's something I really want to lean into this year, actually, quite heavily, is that really interesting balance between what is a tool and what is an installation, and maybe the installation can then generate the work. So from starting to build my own furnaces, like be it like the smelting one, to my new bronze furnace, and then thinking how can I get that to reach more people. I think getting people making like this it's great, isn't it? It's good for your mental health, it's good for like people feeling value, it's good for skill sharing, and I don't think enough of it happens. I've found out the hard way, I think, of like 10 or 13 years of like knocking on people's doors, being like, can you help me, and it, you have to ask a lot of questions and build up quite a big network. But now I'm in a position where I feel quite lucky that I can be like, yeah, go on then, I don't care. It's like people have shared the knowledge with me, so isn't that nice to be then able to share it, to pass it on, and that like word of mouth storytelling element to it's art, isn't it? It's great. It's
where like there's magic like being created. You talk about your furnace. You've mentioned it a few times, so now I'd invite you. Can you like tell us a bit more? Is this, you said, a mobile furnace, a mobile bronze furnace?
Well, the drawings I don't actually have any online of yet, unfortunately. So I've just done I'm like praying everything. So I just did an application. I won't say what it is, but if I got it, it would be so wonderful because it would give you, the budget to do it. I've started bits and bobs of it. How I imagine it is going back to that book I mentioned earlier, the Myths and Origins of Fire. But what I want to do is write a new chapter for the modern age. So this furnace, this kind of dystopian furnace, will be hand pulled. But obviously,
what do you mean by hand pulled?
Well, it's gonna, instead of like how a horse and cart, the straps for a horse would go over its back, and a horse could move quite heavy things. But this huge installation is just going to have two hand grips at the front where the horse would go. So it kind of, I want to create this idea of this futuristic being, this mythical metalworker who actually physically pulls this. I mean, the thing is about, imagine 3 mini-sized carriages. So the first carriage is the workshop, which will have an LED fire pit. People will be able to come around, sit around it, have classes, have lessons, skill share. The next cart on it is the workshop where we do wax sculpting, modelling, and the third carriage to this is the actual bronze furnace. So you couldn't pull it by hand, but it's like, I like the idea of creating this mythical character who could pull their own workshop.
Yeah, I mean that speaks volumes to kind of like traditions. I think of like Hephaestus, and that's quite a being that you're constructing there.
Yeah.
And I hope we all get to see it.
I do too.
When it comes to technology, now I don't think you probably have much of an issue with this, but perhaps you do, because you bring stuff that ideas and processes that people aren't used to using in their daily lives. And we've spoken about that, especially the idea of fire and whilst when you talked about like people using computers as being like adverse to the type of work that you make, equally when that computer dies and if the power isn't on, can they make a fire is quite an important question. So when you are engaging with technology as a question, what is artistic and what is novelty? Is it important to distinguish the two? And how do you find people respond to that?
Cool, that's a hard question. I think that if I answer this right, you can say or not. But
there's no right answer.
I mean, novelty is a difficult word because I suppose that again leads back to this, maybe the idea of like the imposter or something like that. But there has to be humor in things for me. And I suppose that I don't know how to answer this question. I'm sorry. Like, I suppose I'm stuck on that one. Sorry.
So I think something that you've written about was
something
that you've written about was like the idea of craft.
Okay.
And like because you mentioned it like growing within artistic circles, and I think I noticed this when I was at Chelsea doing my bachelor's, and have seen it since more quote-unquote craft activities being employed within a quote-unquote fine art sphere.
Yeah.
And it happened with my own work when I started using computation, using video game software where I would make something that interested me and I was using this technology as the means, but not necessarily the thing that I was doing.
Okay.
But I would struggle with the novelty of it being what people latched onto rather than investigating the artwork.
Got you.
Anything. So perhaps I guess that's
the angle. So, well, I mean, is the novelty so bad in that instance? I mean, for me, if it's a novelty, that word can also be associated with, like a unique idea or something which, as long as it captures people's interest and they keep talking. I mean, how can we really control what people take out of our artwork? I mean, I suppose it's our job as artists to try and really like point people into how we think and what we're trying to get at. But I often feel like when I make, I don't actually. I suppose this was the idea of where slowing down came from, is because I am just as guilty as what I'm trying to preach against, in that I am blindly making. I am blindly in the panic, like, oh my God, if I don't make something today, I'm gonna freeze up and I'm never gonna be able to make anything ever again. So that generation of generating, we are a generation of generating. The novelty, if people I don't mind how people read my technologies or how they see them really, and as long as I can maybe open their eyes to like how things are done or how things are made, that's really it. That's great. I mean, even if you don't understand it, it at least makes people question how things are made, doesn't it?
What is a technology that you either anticipated or were looking forward to, either that was being created or that you were learning how to use, but that you felt was a disappointment?
Ooh. In terms of my own workshop, would that be helpful to think about?
Yeah.
I mean, I know that laser cutting and plasma cutting is like so useful, and I suppose in the terms of my own workshop, I started to use laser cut parts, but then found that there was something very uniform and a bit sterile about them. So that is like an interesting one where I'm like really struggling at the moment. So, could I just write files and have things laser cut in steel and then and then use them, or do I use my like hand plasma cutter and create every shape individually? Because then I'm even thinking back to the past when people would have to cut it with saws and hand saws. So perhaps that the computer in that sense is dulling things
like,
for me.
Makes it sterile.
It makes it sterile. Like you know, like what you've got, you can cut 200 pieces exactly the same, but is there any beauty in that?
I do remember your final piece in your show was lots of hand plasma cut objects and like the little molten blobs that like kind of accrue around the edges, like really give a life to these little things.
Definitely. There's something beautiful in, for me, in like non-uniformity. And like the idea of the hand being present. So I think in that sense, that kind of technology, I had really high hopes for it, but then I keep going back and back as the labor and the process being part of it so much that maybe I just have to get over that.
Now, whatever stage you think you're at, what was the moment? How did you know that you had made it there? What is the point where you've reached whatever kind of plateau in your life that you're at? Not to say that your life has plateaued. I mean, do you ever plateau? So I think I'd answer that in that I constantly feel like I'm an amateur in making, but then B, you look back and you start realizing actually people are asking you to do a talk. People are asking you to work for them. People are asking you for advice. So it's little moments like that which make you think, okay, I'm not as bad as I think I am. And we all like judge ourselves, don't we? We all think, oh gosh, I'm not. And I think that essentially is the key to all makers, isn't it? It's like constantly striving to improve and not feeling like you've plateaued, because once you plateau, there's nothing else to learn. So an understanding that you're constantly striving and recognizing you're in that position is great. Now, an obverse to that, what has been your biggest failure or the hardest moment?
Yeah. Ooh, interesting question. I don't know right now because I'm getting a bit tired. The biggest, the hardest moment. I mean, I suppose it's just little things which I wouldn't say I've ever taken on a project which has completely failed. But it's more like those little moments when you're in your workshop and it's cold or and things aren't going the way they should be going and you don't know how to get out of it. So it's more the biggest failure. I mean, I'm really struggling at the moment with a project, but I think that's more to do with external boundaries being put on a project. So it's a piece where people keep putting up the wall higher and higher, and I don't know how to work with difficult partners. So that's not
so other people.
Other people sometimes.
Hell is other people.
Other people, yeah.
And finally, hopefully you'll listen to this podcast.
Yep.
Could you if you were to be a regular listener, who is a future guest that you would like to hear?
Ooh, I'd probably invite on the guy who taught me a lot about metalwork and blacksmithing. He's called Pete Smith. He is a really interesting thinker about how things are made and ancient technology. He used to be called the Wizard at blacksmithing school just for his kind of way, his magical way. So yeah, I think he'd be a really interesting guest and very detached from kind of art world. So would definitely give an interesting perspective on things.
Wonderful. Well, Katie Surridge.
Yeah.
Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.